Welcome back, book nerds. This is Library Card, the show for people who want to think deeply about the books they read and get inspired to read more. I'm Megan Gliona. I'm here with Brian Brinkman and RJB. And today we're going to be talking about a book that the New York Times said just might be a masterpiece. We're going to be talking about James by Percival Everett. And I guess we're going to get into if this book is a masterpiece or not. We're going to make the definitive answer today. So we will get into that soon. First, we're going to share a little bit about what we've been reading and then tell you briefly about a new series that we are going to launch soon. And then we'll get into this conversation about James. So let's get started. It's a new season. RJ, it's spring. What are you reading this spring?
Oh man, spring. What am
Spring.
I reading? I'm reading the classic romantic suspense novel Rebecca, which
I
I
love
think
Rebecca.
I think maybe you recommended it like last year, and I put it on the
Yeah.
list. It's hard for me to know where things came from because I have this complicated algorithm of incoming requests, and now it's here. So I'm reading it. I'm reading a book of short stories also, but yeah, I'm getting into this like totally different book than at least than anything I've read recently. So I've had the last few books I've read, I've been like excited for them to be over, like the past few novels. So I'm like I'm ready to be in a universe for a while. If that makes sense.
Well, that book has
I
one of
get
the
that.
best opening lines of all time.
Yeah,
So you're entering a
famous.
rich world. It's not really an April spring world, but it's still a good world to be in,
Yeah, yeah.
regardless of the time. How about you, Brian? What are you reading?
I'm reading In the Distance by Hernan
Oh,
Diaz,
yes.
who wrote Trust. I picked this up. I kind of wanted like an esoteric Western, and it very much is that. The last 2 years since I read Lonesome Dove, the idea of the Western has really blown me away, both in film and literature. And it's felt like a great next step in terms of what I wanted to read. I'm about 3/4 through it. It's like 250 pages, and I'm just crawling. And it's not because it's not good. It's very dense, um, and it's starting to take on that kind of travelogue where a character goes through a ton of experiences, travels, kind of a classic type of approach. But in this form, it almost feels like any sort of sense of suspense is gone, and any sort of sense of like alignment with a character or like need to know what happens to the character is gone, because I kind of just know as it goes along, he's going to go one place. It's going to be hard. He's going to meet some people. He's going to see some things. He's going to go another place. And I think, to like what RJ was saying, I'm a little ready for this to be over and to be on something different. It hasn't captured me, blown me away, bowled me over the way that I wanted it to. So that's where I'm at novel wise. But I did just finish a nonfiction book that I want to recommend to everyone out there called Empire of the Summer Moon, which is about the US military campaign against the natives in the mid 19th century, specifically focusing around battles against the Comanches in the 1870s. And this warrior who was born to a half white, half native set of parents. It gives you this big backstory about the Comanche tribe, big backstory about westward expansion and the philosophies behind westward expansion and manifest destiny, and what happens when an aboriginal tribe meets a modern society and the conflicts that ensue. And it absolutely blew me away. I just finished it yesterday. It could work for a lot of people as like a uh, all-in-one 19th century American history book. It reads like a novel. Just totally took me over. So highly, highly recommend Empire of the Summer Moon. In the Distance, maybe the last 70 pages will like fully get me, but this is it's a bit of a crawl right now.
When does that book take place? The Hernan Diaz book? Is it contemporary?
No, it's mid 19th century as well.
Okay.
It's as I it never really gives you like a specific place in time. It kind of forces you as the reader to know both Western geography and a little bit of 19th century history. But as it seems, he came to Western California right around the gold rush, and then is trying to um, navigate his way across America, having no idea how big America is, to reunite with his brother in New York City, who he knows his brother's in New York City. And so he's, for the majority of the book, has been wandering the West at this point in time.
Yeah, I'm curious to read it just because I have really complicated feelings about trust, and so I'm trying to figure out if it's his writing or just the way that book was laid out. But yeah, interesting to hear that your take on that.
I definitely don't not like it. It's just
Yeah.
like it's so dense, and it may be one of those things that, like, by the end of the book, I will see what he's laying out, and like the writing is really he's clearly taking time with every single word and every single sentence. It's all very intentional. It's not like, something like the bee sting, where he probably added 200 extra pages that you ultimately needed because they provide that color and that texture. This is like as refined as possible. Um, and maybe that just writing style doesn't totally work for me. I don't know. It's interesting.
All right, we'll see if I check it out. I also just finished a really economical book that I think you both might be sort of interested in. It's called An Amorous Discourse in the Suburbs of Hell, and it's from a Booker
That's a
shortlisted
title.
poet. Yeah, she's amazing. Her name's Deborah Levy, and it's a poetic novella, and it's a conversation between an angel from paradise and this man that she goes to rescue from the suburbs in London. And it's their struggle between her desire to bring him to paradise and his desire for the simple pleasures in life. And so it's about where those two conflict and where they align. It's funny, it's romantic, it's playful, it's wholly unique. I read it in about 30 minutes. It's really slim. And it's a great introduction to poetry. So if you're someone who doesn't read a lot of poetry or feels intimidated by it, this is funny, really contemporary, and really accessible. So I would highly recommend that. And I'm reading another nonfiction book. I'd like some applause. I'm feeling very proud of myself about this. Thank you. Yeah, my second of the year. This book is called Your Brain on Art, How the Arts Transform Us. And it's by Susan McSalmon and Ivy Ross. This book explains a lot of things that I think the three of us and anyone who's a frequent consumer of art really understands. And that is that art is healing and crucial to our well being, that it impacts our learning and also creates community. But this book explains the science behind this and the transformative nature of the arts on our brains and also on our bodies, our physical bodies, which is cool. And I was thinking a lot about it because I feel like the three of us talk a lot about the importance of art and if it is sometimes more escapist than, a good use of time. Um, and so this book really validates excessive consumption of art. So I highly recommend it. It can tell us everything that we do is great and nobody should give us a hard time about it. Just keep reading and writing, watching movies and podcasting about it. All you want. It's good for us.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like the affirmation. Are you finding, as you read more nonfiction, you're enjoying how like a good nonfiction book is organized, like around just like clear, like linear thoughts that provide you with like insights to something you kind of knew about, but like needed someone to explain to you?
Yes. And I've found, though, that as a response to that, I'm seeking out the opposite in my literature. Like I'm reading a lot more poetry because it is so much the opposite of that.
Yeah.
So I
Mm,
don't know if that's like a response to that, but I'm also just trying to read more poetry in general. But I do think that
sure.
it's a response to feeling very structured in other reading because I do read for escapism mainly.
Mm, mm,
I read to learn, but secondary. I think I read to feel good. And
that's
then,
interesting. All the different approaches that we have.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that sometimes nonfiction doesn't, like when I get in bed at night, when I read it, I don't really want to read nonfiction because I'm like trying
You
to
don't want
feel
to read someone
good.
who's like, let me prove this argument in a very clear and concise way for you. Yeah.
Exactly. So then I find out I have to like set up time to read nonfiction differently. But yeah, I do think that one thing that we all agree on is the importance of community and how good that is for us. And so we have an idea that is a way for us to bring more community to this podcast. And We also wanted to bring more Library Card to you, but make it accessible for you to read along and engage with us. So we are going to be starting a new series. We're going to be continuing to do our longer episodes on novels, the deep dive episodes that we've been doing every 3 weeks, but we are going to start doing shorter episodes on a weekly basis, and we're going to read short stories. And RJ, I would love it if you would share with us our first collection that we're reading from and maybe why we chose this as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think over the next few weeks, at least 2 of the stories out of the 4 from this book will be discussed, and we'll see if we go further than that. But the book is called Stag Dance. It's a collection of short stories by Tori Peters. Tori Peters, in my opinion, is basically the foremost representation of like trans authors in America right now. She got an MFA from Dartmouth, which that's where my wife went to college. So there's some Dartmouth crossover and appreciation. But more importantly, I know trans people in my life, and understanding kind of it's not political. It's not, none of these stories are about politics in any sense. It's more about like people's um, personal evolution in a really strange and bizarre fictionalized way, as well as like kind of the lines between gender and sexuality and femininity and masculinity in America. It's truly, the stories are great. They're really weird, and like the first one that we'll talk about next week is the first one in the book, and it's just so crazy that it's kind of hard to explain. So we'll have to talk about it. But I think she's an important author for the reasons I've stated, but also the writing is just there's like within every sentence is something. She's a really just fantastic writer, and tons of insight into kind of a group of people in America that I think are like not very well understood. So that's part of the reason. She wrote a book called Detransition Baby a few years ago, which was a pretty popular book. That was more about kind of like a group of trans people in New York who are going through various things related to that. That's a much more like contemporary look at kind of trans life in a city. But these are like short stories that are truly just out there. So there's like a little sci-fi, there's a little like, teen romance, there's a little like the title story, which I think we'll talk about, Stag Dance, is about a group of loggers who are like illegally logging on this mountain in Montana in the middle of the winter. Just truly crazy stuff.
It sounds like it has a really wide scope. I'm super excited to read this. I don't read enough short stories, and so this is a great excuse to dive into that, and also to read an author from a group of people that I think needs a lot more representation. So thank you for bringing it to us, RJ.
Yeah, I can't wait
Yeah.
to dive into this.
Yeah, it's gonna be fun. It's gonna be fun and weird, and that's what we're trying to do.
Perfect. Well, we should get started talking about the novel that we're here to talk about today. This is the second novel that we're discussing on this show that uses a book from the literary canon as inspiration. Last episode, we discussed Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. That was inspired by Dickens' David Copperfield. And James is a reimagining of the Mark Twain novel, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, from the perspective of the enslaved character known as Jim in Twain's novel and James in Everett's novel. Everett is a really interesting writer. He's super prolific. He's a painter, and he's also a professor at USC. And watching his interviews was really fun. He's sort of a reluctant interviewer, and it's really cool to see him talk about his process and kind of get pulled out. And he's really interesting and someone who has written a lot of books and is probably most known now for his novel Erasure, which just was turned into the incredible film American Fiction, which I highly recommend if you have not seen it. But James is a reimagining from one character's perspective, which is a very different exercise and use of the original text than Kingsolver's. Everett has said that this book feels in conversation with Twain as opposed to a corrective or as using the story as inspiration. To me, the biggest thing about this novel, though, is that it's pushing up against one of the issues that contemporary audiences have with Twain's novel, and that's the use of the vernacular and the racist slang. And Everett is really subverting that by making language one of the most important thematic structures of the story. So I think that's where we have to begin this conversation today, by talking about language and its use in the book and the overarching theme of the power of language in this book. So I wanted to start us there. Does anyone have any kind of jumping off thoughts about that theme in the book?
Well, I mean, I think that to me is the most engaging, most memorable, and most successful aspect of the entire story. Throughout it, James kind of like he switches back and forth in the way that he communicates. If he's talking to white people, if he's talking to someone who, from a societal standpoint, is above him, he is speaking in this very simplistic, almost childish, just you know, uh, kind of as agreeable of a way as possible without trying to promote any sort of conflict. Um, and in a way that almost like reasserts this white perspective of intelligence and control over enslaved black people. um, he gives them essentially what they're looking for, to just kind of like put his head down and um, move through the world without any conflict. But then when he is sharing his inner thoughts, or when he's speaking to his fellow slaves at the plantation that they're at, he speaks in a much more elegant and a much more intellectually minded manner. And the idea, as you're reading through the book, is that you never actually had us down. You economically, structurally had control over us, but you never actually controlled our emotions. You never actually controlled our brains. We were
Mm.
able to learn at the same pace you were. We were able to understand the world and understand the complexities of the world. We were just adapting, in this sort of manner to, you know, pause as much conflict as was possible. And I think as you read through the book and you see it from that perspective, there is like a great argument made for both Huck Finn and James to stand side by side, because they show this real complexity in American history over the values that we espouse, but the actions that were taken for so long and continue in so many ways to repress people and to oppress people, that we are simply not taking the time to understand and listen to and hear out and find points of agreement on. And so I'll let you guys kind of carry from there. But like, to me, this was when I think about this book 3-4 months later after reading it, this is the thing I continually come back to.
Yeah, I think anyone who's seen American fiction, you can tell just by that adaptation of his book. Like Percival Everett is a subversive kind of writer,
Mhm.
and the idea of code switching is something that seems new. I think to a lot of people, like it's kind of associated with Gen Z, and I think like millennials to a large degree. Like it like a lot of things, these kind of like undercurrents of racism that people have lived with for centuries and have just become kind of made we as white people have just become made aware of them in a lot of
Yeah.
ways,
Yeah.
and I think like he takes that and then applies that idea to something that is what it a classic American kind of story, which I think is really smart and also subversive and also just it works perfectly, and I think it's just crazy to me that 140 years after Huck Finn was written, that this was, like, as far as I know, the first attempt to show this story from the perspective of Jim. You know, like
Yeah.
it seems so obvious in a way. Like, what was going
Yeah.
through, what was his experience, and like here we are this long after, and it just shows how ingrained, kind of our own systemic racism and perspectives are, you know.
Absolutely. I think that's also a huge. I want to circle back to the power of language, but before that, I do want to talk about this idea of a racial construct and how racial identity is constructed. And I think he plays a lot with that in erasure as well, in feeding people the stereotypes that they expect. And that racial identity is constructed by the players involved. and it's also seen and unseen. And so we perform for each other, and how white people use power to define their identity, and blacks act as so in the book, so as not to threaten that power structure, but they're subverting it underneath the surface. And I think thinking of there's kind of three different voices for James in the story. There's the voice that he speaks to as an enslaved person. There's the voice that he speaks to when he's speaking to other people. And then there's the narrator voice, which is really a reflective voice because it has
Mm.
the distance and the reflection. And the way that Everett moves between those so easily, to me, just shows the depth of intelligence that it takes to code switch like that, and how important that was to survival. And I agree, when I think about this book, when I realized, that scene that where James is teaching the children to do this, and he's teaching them how to speak in this vernacular and how to not only speak this way, but allude to the person's power even in the way that you're answering. So it's not just how you're speaking, but it's also the intention behind the words. And I think he talks so much about that, is that it doesn't really matter what's said, it's the intention behind the words. And I think reading this book through the lens of current days and thinking about how Black Americans have reclaimed words to define the intention between them, it seems to me that's how the enslaved people were using this dialect and this vernacular to outsmart the people that were enslaving them, to subvert them. And it's cool because it's like an interesting early form of reclaiming that I had never thought of. And he does say that, Everett said in an interview that he went and researched to make sure nobody had written this book before, and he could not believe
Mm.
it hadn't happened. And it is pretty shocking to think that this narrative of young America, told from the perspective of a young white child, would be just the accepted story, and it's so interesting that it's taken this long for that to kind of come to light, and for someone to do it in this way using one of Twain's main tools, which is satire, which we can talk about later. But I think it's really interesting how he uses language in this book. I think it's brilliant.
I think beyond language as well, one thing that you just kind of hinted at is the ages of James versus Huck and the representation of America based on their ages. A part of
Hmm.
the appeal of Huck Finn is that he is the stand-in for America as a teenager. And, so all of these wrongs that are happening in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, um, before then, but during the setting of this, by mid 19th century, we still have slavery dominating half of our economy, or half of our population. It's going to lead to a civil war. It's kind of this misunderstood, we mean well, but we can't get out of this. And so you have a teenage boys can do really awful things. And they can say really horrible things, and they can say things that are very misguided, but it's a teenager. He's going to learn. He's going to grow up and be
Hmm.
an adult. But all the while, we're almost speaking of that as in the sense of America as beginning in the 1770s, when the reality is America began 150 years prior to that. The modern perception of Europeans coming to America. And with Europeans coming to America, they brought enslaved Black people. And the time that they have lived here is now represented by an adult who has kids of his own, who has perspective. And the fact that he's able to kind of toy with this idea of the generational view of what America could be, but what it actually is, without being so heavy-handed and without really like
Yeah.
overtly saying it, like there's a lot of playfulness in this book, and there's a lot of lightness to this book, which I think we will get into, even in the face of a lot of overt darkness, that makes it a really important, but also really like it's easy to understand how this book took over, because it's not like it's beating you over the head with really difficult dark ideas. It's very playful, even in the way that like symbolically it is showing America at these various stages of its own evolution.
Yeah, he talks he talked about that in an interview I was reading about that no art you're gonna consume, like a movie or book, is gonna make you think differently about enslavement, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
So, you're never gonna walk out of a movie and be like, "Wow, now I totally feel different about enslavement." But what he wants you to do is think about that this idea of race has completely defined young America. It's still defining America to this day, and any understanding that we have historically of that is from one side of the story. And so I think he's trying to tell you the other side of that story, but he's so smart in how he's doing it. And he did this in Erasure too. He makes you laugh while it's happening. And I think that there's a lot of incredible art that can do that. That can I think of even like this is sort of a weird comp, but I think of parts of Anora, the film, where you're laughing, but you're really uncomfortable because there's something underneath it that's really sinister. And I think he is a genius at doing that in this book. His use of satire is really good. I've heard that he has other books that are similar as well. I haven't read The Trees, but apparently that book is very funny and it's a satire about lynching. So
Mm.
very intense topic, but yeah.
Which all of this is what Twain did. Like this is why Twain is the great American, interpreter and in humor and in novels. Is Huck Finn is at its heart a really like enjoyable read, even as it confronts really difficult issues.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this is like really masterful kind of creation in all the ways that you guys are describing. And I just want to say, a bunch of people have asked me, "Do you need to have read, Huck Finn or any of these stories?" I probably read it like maybe when I was 10 or 12 or something. Like I
Yeah,
did not.
something like that.
You do
Mhm.
not have to go back and read to be able to like enjoy, understand, and absorb this book. Like it's not like
No.
a the in fact, like I didn't even remember most of the scenes from the book that apparently were in both books. So, and I still and I still loved it. So
Well, and
don't worry.
there's enough up front that will make you feel like, oh, I kind of vaguely remember this from Huck Finn, like the opening setting, and then when it diverges, you're on your own. Like
Yeah.
there's no real need for you to have had aside from the cursory knowledge of what Huck Finn is.
Yeah, I remember nothing of Huck Finn, and I really enjoyed this book, but he's not
So
trying to
there's a
tell.
river
Yeah,
and there's a
exactly. I
raft.
think there's
They're
people, like,
getting
on a
away.
raft, right? Um, I kinda remember that, but I do think that he's not trying to tell the Huck Finn story. He's telling James's story, and
Mhm,
he has explained that he didn't attempt to stick to the novel religiously. This one takes place a few decades later because they encounter soldiers, and that would not have happened during Huck Finn's time. So he plays a little bit with time, and also there's a large part of the book, from what people tell me, that you don't know where Jim is, like, they're separated, and so he is taking liberty with what happens with James during that time. The one thing I wanted to ask you both about, and it's tied into language and also I think how he's really thinking about these bigger ideas and how they came in conflict with the great thinkers of the time. But I love the conversations that James has with the philosophers, John Locke and Voltaire. He has these dreams that are sometimes he's awake for them, sometimes he's asleep. And he's debating their views on freedom from an enslaved person's perspective. And it really moved me because that's not something that happened back then. And so this is a discourse that would not have been able to happen, but it clearly puts their views on the defensive and illustrates that even the great thinkers were really selective on how they viewed their philosophies in order to maintain this world order. But he does it in such a creative way. And it was one of those moments when I think a lesser writer, it could have taken you out of the story, but he still enables you to stay within the story, even as he's forcing you to think about something philosophical.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think he retains that kind of playfulness. There's another sort of thematic thing I want to dig into at some point here, but it's in line with this, like the language, the debates from a philosophical standpoint. I mean, there's an argument to be made that the great philosophers and the politicians of the late 18th century um, crafted a system that was just another way to oppress people under the guise of freedom, and that what they were just trying to do was restructure power for themselves, um, away from monarchy. And then there's another line of thinking that they worked within what they had and what was possible in that moment in time, and they set the trajectory for ultimate like expansion of civil rights and freedom. I take the opposite of, or I take that view personally. But that being said, like there's a lot to wrestle with the philosophy and the ideas of um, Voltaire, of Locke, of the founding fathers, of a lot of what was happening in late 18th century France, and take stock of like what still had not been, how long it would take for ultimately a lot of these rights to be expanded, and how we're still having the debates over, are they the right rights to expand, should we pull back on the rights that we're expanding to people. Like these are really difficult conversations to have, and these are really difficult ideas to throw out into the world. um, I think the effectiveness of it in this book is that because you're being placed in a familiar space, but in an unfamiliar character, a character that most people are not reading about from, you know, I don't know the first time you heard of Huck Finn. I know RJ, you said you read it when you were 10 or 11. It was around that time for me. Like this is a formative book in your life and a formative perspective. So you're taking this familiar idea and you're putting yourself in an unfamiliar perspective of it, and then having these conversations. The fact that he's able to retain the kind of lightness within these conversations, I think, is the most important thing. But I'd be curious how it affected you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I I guess you guys might be disappointed with me, but I actually didn't like love those parts of the
Never.
book. I didn't love those parts. I mean, partially because it was sort of like in these fever dream moments for the
Yeah.
most
Sure.
part,
Yeah.
and I felt like it was like there were points being made, but it was also like to further demonstrate how smart James really was, you know?
That's
And I
Definitely.
fair.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I felt like
For
to
sure.
me as I was reading it, to me it couldn't do both things. Like it couldn't both like educate me further on the discourse around the idea of freedom and like show the depth of the character. I don't know. Maybe it's just my own like lack of imagination, but I also think like because it was short and a fast moving story, I kind of like went through those parts without spending too
Mm,
much time like thinking about them. But it felt like a little bit of a more of like a tool used to show that he was, a deep thinker.
more explaining than needed.
Yeah. Like
Yeah.
expository. Did it kind of pull you out of the story?
Yeah, only a little
Mhm.
bit, but I wouldn't like fault it. I just wouldn't like point to that as a part of the book that would like stuck out to me, which is kind of interesting. But again, that like might just be me, you know?
No, I think it's definitely a not like a trick, but it's a way he's using a convention to do some sort of deeper thematic work for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I agree that I can see that because one thing I think he does so well in the book is pacing. This book is paced incredibly well. It's really fluid. I mean, it has that pacing of a river. It's beautifully done, and that I could see it pulling you out of that.
Yeah, I can definitely see that aspect of it. There's something we will get to plot wise that pulled me out of the entire book, and we'll talk about that here in a bit. But this, I felt like, because it was so quick moving, it definitely was expository in that sort of standpoint, but I don't know. I felt like it gave like that ever-present context I'm looking for. That's it. At the end of the day, I just want like give me a little bit of nugget of information to give me a little bit more about what we're talking about.
I really
Yeah.
appreciated it just because especially after reading these truths and thinking about young America and the struggles, to have this lofty ideal that then is withheld from so many people that are actually in that society. It's a real, to me, defining feature of young America, and so thinking about how people must have wrestled with that in the day, in that moment, is interesting, and also interesting that for James, it feels more of an individual philosophy and an issue that he's struggling with internally. But then when he's kind of when they talk about the war happening, that there's gonna be this civil war, he seems very removed from it, and I imagine that so many of the enslaved people at that time were just so caught up in ensuring their daily survival that this idea of a larger civil war or the country's ideals probably have, very little impact on some of them.
Can I
Yeah.
can I share one other thing that worked for me in this book and
Yeah,
get your guys'
please.
thoughts on it? So, I think we're kind of starting to get into slight spoiler territory here. So if you haven't read this
Mhm.
book, and you don't want to know what happens, I would pause this, read the book. It's a very quick read. I think
Yeah.
Megan
It
probably read it in like 2 hours. I read it in 2 weeks, so relatively quick read. Um, so James and Huck, they part ways. I forget the specifics, but at some point he ends up in a minstrel show, and it's like a touring minstrel show. And the things that hit me the most about this segment, um, is when you start to think about the emergence of entertainment in America
Mhm.
and what um, black entertainment means to white people, and that historically, going back 150 years, 180 years at this point in time, um, there's been this like co-opting of black entertainment into the white world, where there's almost like a passivity in the way that white people interact with black art. And it is this like there's a book on my shelf here, called A Little Devil in a little of the Devil in White America, I think is what it's called. And it's about black blues musicians and jazz musicians, and this idea of like the devil's music that is seeping its way into white American culture. And we would see 100 years after James's set, blues and jazz and R&B work their way into white culture, take over in the 1950s, and explode into rock and roll as we knew it in the 1960s and become white culture. And you really get a sense, and it's a small segment of this book, but it really hit me how far back this goes and how far back
Mm.
this idea of, you know, the people with the power structure look at a certain race of people and say, well, you are not worthy of holding the level of power, the level of influence that we have. But man, we cannot get enough of the way you guys sing and dance. And like we can't look away from it. Like it's almost like a drug that feeds us in this way. And it creates this, having it written from James's perspective and his experience of watching these white audiences take in what he's doing, blew my mind. And I'd love to hear, I, I don't know if this because there were a lot of these little like diversions he goes down. This was the one for me that like just hit and spoke on a lot of levels of what I think Everett was trying to get across, that
Mhm.
um you've held these people down for so long in so many different ways, but you can't quit them. And like what they offer you is actually this drug that you cannot keep, you have to keep going back to over and over and over again.
Well, there's a leeching sense of taking
Yeah.
what you want from something and disrespecting the rest, but I think that's very intentional that that stuck with you on Everett's part. The book starts with one of these songs, and that person was a real person. That was a real minstrel show, and he wrote many of those songs. And what Everett is showing you is that you recognize part of these songs, right? Like you recognize Yankee Doodle Dandy, you recognize Dixie, you recognize these songs. And the ones that he put in the book are some of the least offensive ones. His songs are very offensive and very racist. And Everett wants you to know that the things that children learn, these songs have deep histories that are incredibly racist and use Black culture as a way to feel better about yourself and also, yeah, take what you want from it and reclaim it and call it yours. And it is, I think, done very intentionally. So I'm not surprised that that kind of stuck with you, Brian, because I do think it was part of what he wants you to think about is that like that scene when he's they think he's like a white person doing blackface, but he's actually a Black person doing blackface. The kind of layering of that is so intense that he's watching these white people think that he's a white person acting Black, but he's a Black person acting Black. It's so layered and allows him into conversations that he wouldn't have been in otherwise because people think he's white. And so there's so much in that. And also it's like it's kind of the beginning of another thing that he talks about in this book, which I think is another theme, which is white privilege. And to get into the main spoiler, is it okay if we talk about the main spoiler of the book now?
Yeah, I think we have to.
We have to, right?
This is the spoiler of all spoilers. So
this is
like,
it. So
if you've made it through here, now is when I would stop.
Like for real, stop. You will ruin the book. But when we find out that James is Huck's father, I had a real problem with it because for me, the whole book felt like, well, I will say, I think I understand what my problem is now about it. But for me, the whole book felt driven by James's desire to be with his family. Like that's why he runs away. That's why he's trying to figure out where they are, trying to figure out how he can get to safety, how he can get them to safety, how they can be together as a family unit. And I don't know if there's enough built in as to we don't really learn a lot about James as a father, but we see him as a community member and as a deep thinker. But I don't know that Everett puts a lot of time into building his relationship with the family, explaining that to the reader. And I don't know that he needs to, but it's just something to note. But I think that finding out that he was his father, to me, I was shocked by it, first of all, because I didn't think that he'd been acting like he was Huck's father. And maybe that's because I don't understand the privilege that he was affording Huck by letting him pass and by distancing himself from him. And I think that I've had to think about that a lot because it really I didn't love that part of the book because I didn't really believe it, but maybe that's because I just don't have a strong enough understanding of how someone would choose to leave their child because they knew that the child would be better off that way. I'm not sure. How did that hit you and what do you think about that?
For me, it reminded me immediately of the movie Conclave, in the sense that like you had this great story. I don't want to spoil two things now, but you had this great story that was really in depth and was really it was making you wrestle with ideas. And then at the very end, it gives you this shocking twist that now I guess, and this is part of the point, like, okay, go read the book now from this perspective. But also like I felt the same way you did, where I didn't necessarily believe it. And I almost felt like it adds it's a whole nother book in and of itself. And
Yeah.
I don't necessarily feel like by the time we got to that, it was the story that he had been telling. And so now you're wrestling with all of these hints between the two and hints between, and maybe the goal is just to get you to reread Huck Finn and be like, wait, was there something in there that Mark Twain was trying to tell us?
Yeah.
I don't know. Like, I feel like you can do this really well where you give a shock ending that satisfies and adds to a lot of elements of the book that came prior,
Yes.
or you give a shock ending that is a shock ending and somehow takes away from a lot of like kernels you've already laid out there, that are important enough in and of itself. Like, it's important enough to read a story from James's perspective and understand that what you were told he is actually far different from who he is. And then you add something like this where you're now trying to piece together, hints and puzzle pieces throughout. It ended up feeling a little gimmicky to me, and it felt a little to me like you needed this in there to give a mass audience a shock turn that everybody ends up talking about, when IMO, the content before that is what people should be talking about. What are
Yeah, and
your
I
thoughts
think
on
that RJ, before you jump in, I think that there's when you spend an entire book in someone's interiority, to then discover a massive part of that interiority has not been discussed at all feels weird.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought, yeah, for the reasons that you guys both described, I mean, I don't know, maybe this is blasphemous to say, but it seemed unnecessary, you know? I mean, we're
Yeah.
like, you're
That's how I
seeing
feel.
yeah, the kind of, I mean, if he was doing everything he was doing for the humanity of, making decisions to try and protect Huck or whatever, like that's probably enough, you know? That said, I think it, yeah, mostly confused me a little bit for the reasons you pointed out, Megan. So, yeah, I mean, this is my second favorite book of last year, so I don't like have a lot of problems with it. But because I think the character development and the dive into the the interiority, as you said, Megan, like makes up for anything. But
Mhm.
plot wise, plot wise, I didn't really care that much, like what was happening,
Mhm.
because I thought that the
Oh, interesting.
kind of the main point was, to me at least, was that this was like this kind of complex, very brutalized, educated person was like living this life that in the other telling of the stories we didn't know anything about, um
Mm,
but
that's a good way to put it.
yeah, I don't know, that's interesting. I think it was confusing. I think it was like a confusing turn at the end.
It's interesting because you had this book rated so high last year, and I think it's interesting to hear you say, like, the contents within almost like the plot didn't matter and that sort of standpoint, because that's kind of how I felt about like the bee sting. Like, when we talked about that book, it was like, well, a lot happens, but also not a lot happens. It's literally just about like this family is messed up and how do they, and so like
Yeah.
either that works for you or it doesn't. And I
Yeah.
think it's interesting that, like, for me, this ending kind of threw me off the scent and made me annoyed and made
Mm,
me kind of like resentful in a way. And for you, it sounds like the what was already in there, what the contents were, overcame whatever like negative feelings you would have gotten from this. And clearly, like, I think I'm in the minority here. Like, the majority of people who seem to have read this, I've had a number of people text me after reading it being like 5-star masterpiece, no questions asked. And
Same.
I have
yeah.
questions about the
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just like, I mean, I guess in some ways I'm not a huge, like, I know maybe this is weird to say. I don't think I'm like a big plot person. Like, I don't know, plot like doesn't really matter as much to me in a book like this as the character evolution and development. But I mean, I did think like the
Yeah.
very the
Mhm.
very end of the book was one of the reasons why I think it's like so great. Like the last scene, because
Yeah.
reinforcing that
Yes.
he's like, a who actually does have the power, at the end of the day, I think is really pretty amazing. So I think the end stuck with me the most out of anything plot wise, and I think it kind of made the book for me.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you say that you didn't
Yeah.
care about what happened in the plot because I hadn't realized that I agreed with you until you said it, and then I was like, "Yeah, I didn't really care either," because every situation, all you really care about in that situation is he gonna survive, right? Like, is he
Right.
gonna survive this moment? Is he gonna be okay? And every turn is like some new moment to navigate, and so it's which is similar to the bee sting. I think there's just constantly, like, shit being thrown at you, and you're just trying to, like, see how they're gonna handle that, and I think that's really interesting, especially when you think about how important plot is to stories, but then also how little it matters when you have a really good writer or you have a character that's as compelling as James. I am so confused as to why he chose to do that when I do think the ending, I agree, RJ, it would have been strong enough without that. It's so powerful. It's so cinematic. I think the scene with everything up in flames and them running is just so incredibly moving. And yeah, I don't think he needed that whole
Well,
turn.
I think they're the to me the main, and I don't speak for him because I have no idea, but it seems like you could make the case that the main reason to do that um, is that now you're introducing a kind of a classic American character as biracial, right? So like
Right.
Mhm.
That's
I
true.
think that's like the most because I
That
do
is
think
very true.
I think his motivations are often to like as I said earlier, like I think he's a subversive
It's
writer and I
subvert.
think that's like a way to really like change the whole thing and to change the thinking about, stories that we've been told or have read our whole lives involving white people from this era when, we know that, you know, there tons and tons of white landowners and wealthy people were impregnating slaves and like that whole aspect of it I think which we now know is probably much more prevalent than we would have imagined long ago. Maybe that's like the thing.
Okay, this is it for me. That thank you. I feel like I needed to hear that because now I understand why he may have made that
Well,
choice.
Yeah.
I
So
don't know
this
that
is
it's true.
really, really
No,
It's a
it's
helpful.
theory.
just it's a good it's because
It's a good guess, if nothing else.
well, and it turns on its head this idea that like the aw shucks teenager American who doesn't know any better, but is ultimately a good person to his black slave. And that being the Huck Finn story and the idea of like, you know, American history is told in the sense of we introduce these rights and these ideas, but we don't extend them to everyone, but slowly but surely we grant you freedom. And without the Union fighting and freeing the slaves and Lincoln freeing the slaves, you never would be freed. Without the civil rights movement that white politicians put forward, there's no expansion of rights. This kind of twists on its head in the sense that, like, no, you should actually look at American history as black and white in more union than it's told. And this
Mm,
idea that the this like central fictional character in American history is biracial completely changes the idea of American history in a lot of ways. So I appreciate you saying that. Who knows if that's what he was going for, but that definitely helps me as well understand it. I do just want to note, like, from a plot standpoint, the final scene kicks fucking ass.
it's
And
so good.
it backs up this idea of like this should be turned into a movie like almost immediately because
Yeah.
you could see that and you can imagine like the strings coming, like really ominous music behind you. And like, there just is like incredible imagery in that. And it really does a nice job of tying a story up in like a bow in a way that like a lot of books we've talked about here have kind of left you being like, huh, I wonder what happens. Like this gives you like a real clear boom ending, move on, but great stuff.
Yeah, I loved the ending. I think the tone of it is triumphant in a way that feels necessary after the book. I did wanna ask you both about the tone. Sometimes when I read books or watch movies and characters are really exaggerated stereotypes, it pulls me out of the story. And I think that one thing that Everett does that's so smart is he flips it and the stereotypical characters are the white characters. And I was thinking that tone is really hard to do. I think about movies, like I just rewatched American Beauty recently, And certain characters in that movie are exaggerations, but they still can deliver, like Annette Bening, she's still delivering, like, incredible emotion that is believable and real through an exaggerated character, and I think he's really good at that, and this was a tone that sometimes I felt pulled out of the book, and sometimes I felt like he was nailing it, but I was curious as to if how you see that, like, how does an exaggerated character or a stereotypical character pull you out of a book or not when you're reading or even a film?
I really like things to be grounded. I'm not really like an exaggerated person, so it's a huge challenge for me. I found like, um, well, I was just thinking like how much I enjoy these conversations because I never would have thought that about the Revelation. Had we not like just sat down and had like an organized conversation around it, so I appreciate that. Because like ultimately, my takeaway from this book is that he accomplished telling a very difficult, very dark story in a light, playful, but still emotionally effective manner that can be understood and appreciated by a mass audience. And I think that that's a huge win and that's a huge celebration. I think ultimately the tone is not necessarily in my wheelhouse of what I'm looking for when like I really get into a book. Where I want like all of the mud and the nitty-gritty and like the ugly stuff to be in there. This felt like it kind of like the complaint or critique I was making about the book I'm currently reading, In the Distance. I felt like the tone gave you a sense of like it was a page turner, but you
Mhm.
were like, okay, and then James did this, and then James did this, and then James did this. And for me, the effectiveness was whatever scenes within there really got into nuance, but I don't feel like there was a ton of that throughout this. Like the tone was just it moved so quickly.
Yeah, and I feel like if it wasn't in this tone, it would be really hard for a lot of people to wanna read. I think,
100%.
humor is, like, disarming you, you can take your medicine with something sweet around it, so I think that's, what he's doing and what Twain did as well, but RJ, what about you? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the Virginia Minstrels group is a good example. I don't know. I thought that like for a story like this, you kind of need those characters to be exaggerated, or maybe you don't
Mhm.
need them, but it works with the storytelling because the storytelling is really like it's almost like a tall tale setup sort of thing, where like the con
Totally.
Yeah.
artists, the duke and the king, like they I don't know, maybe this is what you're saying, Brian, but like there wasn't really room in here to like develop these characters into something more
Yeah.
more serious. It's like they had to be like exactly when you thought of like an 1800s con artist, like it's exactly what you thought of, right? Or the minstrel show or like the woman, the people on the river boat. Like it's all so I felt like it was balanced with the tone of the story, which I think was contrasted further with James, which I think was part of the point, right? That like
Yes.
James is really the only character in the whole book who seemed to be intelligent, and I think that was like an
Yeah,
intentional
Mhm.
contrast, you know.
Yeah, and I
I
think
think you're
that
right.
the this idea of this is really his story, and so much
Yeah.
of this book is about him having the power to write his story and have his perspective expressed, and I was gonna say it's meta, but it's not really because he's being really explicit about it. Everett's explaining, like, this character has taught himself to read and write so that he can write this story down, and the whole time, he's desperately holding on to this little booklet of the minstrel songs and writing his story in it, and, there's a character that's lynched for getting him a pencil, and you realize how hard it was to keep an archive. I have to sneak in this idea of archive into every one of our conversations somehow, but, it is it is a commentary on a lack of archive, I think, and the whole book is James attempting to have his perspective recorded, and it's a commentary on all of the lost perspectives that we've had in this country because we weren't listening.
Yeah, I think like plot wise to me, what really, really like stuck out was all of those scenes you're talking about, which it's like, I think we maybe talked about this, or we're talked about it in our chat. It's like, man, I think as like white readers, it's like, do I need to read more about the brutality of slavery? Like maybe I need to, like, for the rest of my life, because that's like what I need. But it sometimes feels like it's like, can it get any worse, But I think in the context of this story, with the guys who he worked with, and the woman who gets raped, and all this stuff that like was clearly commonplace, in that era, and beyond, is just, he balances that, like the seriousness of that, with, like you said, like some amount of humor, and that just seems so hard to do.
I think also to all of this, like the success of this book, you have this initial reaction, wins a bunch of prizes, it's sold a ton of copies, it's gotten a ton of conversations. We are probably the last book podcast to do an episode on this, but like you kind of
Just in
had to,
time.
you kind of had to talk about this when
Yeah.
when this is one of those current books you have to talk about. But like if you think about the Adventures of Huck Finn, we're talking about 140 years since it came out, 160 years since it came out. That's a book that was written in a very specific political climate and historical climate, and has survived and has remained essential. Will this remain essential in 50, 60, 100, 150 years? That's to be told. I think the way that he wrote this was almost for a timeless, you could hand this to someone in 30 years and be like, here's Huck Finn and here's James, and these two stories tell a very parallel existence in America. I think it's hard to tell that right now, but I do think there was a story he could tell where it's 200 pages longer, and he gets really into the nitty gritty, and he gives you this like awful, harrowing experience of what it was like to be a slave, what it was like to be a runaway slave, what it was like just to live without like indoor plumbing, like just the experience of 19th century America on the frontier, essentially. And he chose to tell, almost a cautionary tale, with humor, of not, um, doubting those just because you have immediate control over them. And I think that
Mm.
there's something there that like will be lasting to this, but it will be interesting to see how this story evolves, because in the immediate moment, it feels very 2024, 2025, almost like Resistance Core in a sense. But will it survive that moment? I don't know.
I can see a lot of English teachers in the future reading both of these texts back to back, as long as our education system still
Yeah, I
exists
was gonna
and
say,
books aren't banned.
are we
But
gonna have teachers? I mean, we'll see.
yeah, as long as we have teachers that can teach things that aren't, from the
Everything will be like
perspective
a
of a white man.
3-page bullet pointed pamphlet. Just
AI produced.
the efficient, what you need to know.
Well,
Oh
can
God.
I, Megan, just add to what Brian was saying. I mean, I think part of the reason that I had this as my number 2 book, like I read a lot of really great books last year, and I think still, like, books that I read that teach me more about things that I know I need to understand further, like, always
Mhm.
mean
Totally.
more, So like I read like some great mysteries with, like, very little point, and they were like fun, but like, something that sticks with you like this is, I think, much more meaningful in a intellectual sense than like something that's, fun or interesting, or whatever. So I think it's
I like
important
that
that we
you're
keep hearing this.
positioning yourself to be on the right side of history in like 50 years. That's good. That's a good move.
We'll see. We'll
Smart.
see, won't
Solid
we?
It was my
thinking.
number 2 book of 2024, I
Or
swear.
I'm positioning myself to be in jail. We'll see. Only time will
This
tell.
is true. This is a
Only
very
time
good
will
point.
tell. So I have a question for you both. In Huck Finn, Brian, you talked about this earlier, but how sort of stands in for young America thematically. Is there another book that either of you can think of or a film where a character or another element of the book kind of stands in for a country or a time period?
Yes.
Wow. Okay, let's hear it.
Well, when you gave us that preview, I immediately thought about Demon Copperhead.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, that's like these are kind of like those stories are kind of they're kind of mirror images of each other in certain ways, you know, about
Totally.
America at these times. But that was just too easy because we just did it last episode. So Brian might have something more insightful. I'm sure you do. One of you two does.
Well, my mind goes to film, and I have two movies specifically that I would want to reference. One is my number two favorite movie of all time, not
Oh,
just of
wow.
2020, yeah, of all time, which is There Will Be Blood. I think Daniel Plainview,
Mm,
that character, is an amazing stand-in for America. And you look at the time frame of that character; it's based about 50 years after HF Pod. My God, Huck Finn. Um, we get our intern in here. I'm reading the comments section where our good friend Forbin777 is saying that HF Pod will teach the children the
Yeah.
future.
love that.
Anyway, rewind that. Huck Finn was, based in the mid 19th century. There Will Be Blood is based in the early 20th century. And so it's almost like Huck Finn 15, 20 years later in his life, he is trying to stake out his riches, his claim in America that's still being adapted. And he does it in this manner using natural resources that are, fossil fuels that are ultimately going to help destroy the planet. He becomes very religious and very but in a very self-righteous and power grab sort of manner. And it kind of explains, like, there's an interpretation that I'm coming up with on the fly, but like, if Huck Finn is allowed to grow up in an America where he feels like, well, I just need to be nice to my slave, and that's enough. That this is where that ultimately leads to from a power standpoint. The other is a movie I watched for the first time this winter called Andrei Rublev, which should be streaming on Max. It should be on Criterion. It is a Russian movie made in 1966. Um, one of many Tarkovsky movies I've watched this winter. This one tracks um, Russia in the mid 14th century as the Mongols are sweeping across the steppes, and it highlights intertribal warfare and the plague and Christianity and this idea of the state versus the people, and the idea of all of this untapped land and potential that is constantly in back and forth uh, crisis and conflict. And it really showcases kind of the Russian perspective, as it looks out at the world and all that the Russian people have available to them from a um, agricultural standpoint, from a philosophical standpoint, from a spiritual standpoint, but that is in constant crisis with elements around it. And it does a nice job of really explaining, at that point in time, the Soviet position in the world and the way that it viewed itself through centuries earlier historical context. So those two movies I would definitely recommend as like a stand-in of like characters for a country.
I had
Megan,
a
I had
really
a
easy
no,
one. Go
go
ahead,
ahead.
RJ.
Yeah, go. No, I was gonna add like a couple others, but from literature, but I want to hear yours first.
Well, I have two that are sort of weird. I mean, the first one's not, it's very easy, but I think Northwoods is a really good example where the setting
Mm.
takes, kind of stands for America as you watch everything happen on that piece of land. And I think it's a really fascinating retelling of America. So if people we haven't read that, you should read Northwoods, and we did an episode on it as well. And this is funny, but while you were sharing yours, it made me think of a movie that is I never would have thought about it in this context, but Annie, the story of Annie
Hmm.
is actually, the story of from a disenfranchised perspective of this orphan who is symbolizing what was going on in America at this time and who was trying to protect America and what forces were coming to get America and how are people working or not working together in America. And yeah, I haven't really thought about it, but I do think just on the surface that story is um, a larger story about America wrapped up in a children's story, which I think is always really hard to do and really cool. And
Once
just
I
something
started
I
thinking,
grew up singing every day when I was
yeah,
a kid.
I would not
Yeah.
have thought about that. And then
Yeah.
and then Jay-Z took it and added to it, which is
It's a hard
just
knock life, you know?
yeah. When I started thinking about your question more, I think some of the like most classic books have that character, right? Like my daughter's just finishing To Kill a Mockingbird. Atticus Finch, I think,
Totally.
Yeah,
represents
yeah.
some aspect of America, not the whole America, but then like Jay Gatsby, is the representation of that time period in, with the kind of big dreamer, the good life, the roaring 20s, like that sort of stuff.
Yeah,
And
J
I
my
think one
daughter
of my
just finished
favorite.
reading that book too
Oh, really?
in school. Yeah.
One of my
Woo!
favorite books of all
Kids are like
time.
reading these like
It's so
foundational
exciting.
books. My
So
I
God,
know.
exciting.
still
It's
I
really
working.
can't
fun
wait
to
for
talk
them.
to them.
I'm excited for my kids to read that one. I'm most excited maybe for when my kids are old enough to read Catcher in the Rye, which is another
Yeah.
book with a protagonist that represents this kind of like you know American search for, I guess, authenticity.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Oh
yeah.
yeah.
So there's like, I don't know, maybe a lot of these classic books, that is the point, is like the main character is a stand-in for America.
Yeah, we should just tell every high schooler, that's all you need to really know for all of your essays that you have to write.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think you have to have, and I think it'd be an interesting conversation to have as we like continue this show in this series. Like, there has to be a certain level of symbolism, but like the national symbolism and the national character is a really interesting perspective to look at. I think I totally agree with what you guys are saying from a Northwood standpoint. I think Demon Copperhead's spot on. Obviously, the classics that you referenced, RJ. Um, there's something about a book like this that can provide at least a view into history while offering you like the more human color and the human tone to
Mhm.
it that you won't get from just reading what was it like to be a slave in the 1840s. This actually like gives you a like a narration, a perspective that you wouldn't have otherwise. Definitely glad I read this book. I'm definitely glad we talked about this. RJ's revelation of the revelation completely impacted me, and I hope that there are other
Same.
people out there that maybe they all read that part and they felt the exact way that RJ did, and he's just going to reassure them, or maybe they were kind of lost in the woods like myself and needed a guide.
Well, to be fair, I didn't even really think about it until we started talking about it. So I think without the conversation, I wouldn't have come to that on my own.
You
Wow,
really
that's
don't
cool.
like taking compliments, do you?
I
No.
know. It's tough. Well, we've kind of talked about books that are similar. Is there any other books that either of you wanna recommend?
Well, we
Yeah.
did.
Go
Go
for it.
ahead. Sorry.
No, I want to hear yours.
Well, I was going to adjust it slightly because we got a question in the chat earlier about 5 relatively contemporary novels. So why don't you recommend something based off of this? Then we can maybe do that before we close.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of fiction, the two things that would come to mind first are The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead,
Oh, so
which is,
good.
another way of taking this idea of the Underground Railroad and totally turning it on its head. And I think I have to like mention The Water Dancer, which is the first novel written by Ta-Nehisi Coates, who's written a bunch of really popular, well-regarded books. This is his first novel, and you know, pre-Civil War South kind of, again, like kind of supernatural book, but not that James was supernatural, but both Colson Whitehead and Ta-Nehisi Coates kind of took this time period and made it a little bit more, more supernatural.
Yeah, I love the magic realism in the Underground Railroad. He uses it so well.
Well,
How
now
about
I
you, Meg?
have two. And now I have two additional recommendations before we jump into the contemporary novels. One, because you mentioned Colson Whitehead, I've got to shout out the best movie from 2024, in my opinion, which is Nickel Boys. Which I've not read the book, but the movie makes you feel like you are in a novel more than any movie I've ever watched. The perspective is directly from the main character, and then it switches about halfway through, and it tells the story of these two kids that end up at a reform school in Florida in, I believe, the 1960s. And there's a white segment of this that is almost like a bit rougher boarding school, and then there's a black section of this that is really repressive and really horrific. And never seen a movie like it. Can't recommend it enough. Similar in this vein. But then the other is a book I read a couple years ago called Homegoing. I don't know if you guys read this, but it tells the story of these sisters who are from, I believe, Ghana, and they get separated. One ends up marrying a local king, for lack of a better term. The other one ends up going to America on a slave ship, and it tells the story of the two of them as they across centuries. It gives you their perspective and then their descendants' experiences. And it's really, really lyrical, really, really colorful, and just I that is a subject matter I had not really approached when I read it, and it kind of hit me hard. What do you have, Meg?
I was just thinking one of my favorite writers, I would just recommend reading Black authors. I think especially reading Zora Neale Hurston. One of my favorite books by her is Their Eyes Were Watching God. She wrote that in the 30s. And she's really great at giving modern readers an idea of what the Black perspective is like back then. I also think reading Nella Larson's Passing is an incredible book, and a book that taught me a lot about the Black experience. Obviously, huge list of very important Black authors that people should be reading, but that's definitely where I would start, is with those two. And what was the question in the chat, Brian? It was about contemporary novels. I mean, just look at our list of books we've covered for this podcast, right?
Yeah, so we've covered all contemporary. So Northwoods by Daniel Mason, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, The Bee Sting by Paul Murray,
Covenant of Water,
Covenant of Water, Abraham Verghese, Clara and the Sun. Who wrote that? I'm so
Ishiguro.
thank you. Those are like what we have highlighted as kind of like some of our favorite current books, if we will. Why doesn't everyone give two other 2020s books for our audience to check out if they want?
I think books we're going to cover soon. I think Orbital by Samantha Harvey is one of my favorite books I've read in a long time. And the book we're going to be talking about next, which is The Safekeep by Yael van der Wooden. Yeah, very, very cool book, and talking about looking at history and coming at it through a totally different angle. It's going to be a really good conversation. How about you, RJ? Any other books that you want to recommend?
No, those are the only books I've read.
Ever?
I guess two slightly different books. I mean, Intermezzo, I loved reading that. That was sort of similar to The Bee Sting, but also very different. Tomorrow, which I think is a really interesting and good one to read. That's very different from any of the ones we mentioned.
It's very readable, light. I mean, the story is kind of intense, but it's not like devastatingly sad like Intermezzo or Bee Sting. Yeah. Awesome. So our next episode is going to be next week, April 2nd, and we're going to be talking about the short story Infect Your Friends and Loved Ones. That's from Stag Dance by Tori Peters. It's about 50 pages, so you can definitely read that in a week if you want to join us. And the week after that, we're going to be talking about The Safekeep, which I just mentioned. So as we've been talking a lot about, subversion is the way to go, and reading is the biggest subversive act you can do. So we're doing our part here, and I hope everyone is doing their part to read and fight the powers that be. All right, everyone, we'll see you soon. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
See you guys.